Hello, my name is Mederick, and this is a message from Med. Last week, Med, Eric, and I discussed the 10th chapter of 1 Samuel. Saul continued demonstrating his obedience and humility even after being chosen to be Israel's first king. Unfortunately, not all of the Israelites were in agreement that he should be king. How will Saul unite Israel to help a besieged city?
This chapter begins with Nahash the Ammonite besieging Jabesh Gilead. The inhabitants surrendered and asked Nahash to make a treaty with them. Nahash said he would, with the condition that he gouge out the right eye of each person in order to bring disgrace upon them. In addition to the disgrace, this was a tactic so that the Israelites would not be able to defend themselves well if they one day decided to rebel. If a soldier used a shield with his left hand, the shield would cover his left eye, limiting his vision. The inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead asked Nahash to give them 7 days to seek help, and if no one came to their aid, then they would surrender. Nahash consented, possibly because he did not think the other Israelites would help them. Additionally, this would be an opportunity for his reputation as a terrorist to spread throughout the land. When news of the siege reached Gabaa, Saul's hometown, everyone grieved. Saul was not present when the news arrived, so he asked everyone why they lamented upon returning. Even though Saul was anointed and named king of Israel, he had not yet taken steps to set up a government. We could say that he was hiding his talent or running away from his calling. But if we remember, everything that happened for him to become king was directed by God. The lost donkeys led Saul to Samuel, the signs Saul saw and experienced when he returned home, and his selection before the people of Israel. It seems like Saul understood that God was in control and that his reign would begin in God's time. This was the exact moment God had prepared for Saul. The Spirit of God came over him, and he was filled with anger and cut 2 oxen in pieces. He then sent them throughout Israel, saying that he would tear up the oxen of those who did not follow him and Samuel. It was important that Saul mentioned Samuel because until then, Saul had done nothing except hide when Samuel called him to come forth among the people of Israel as their king. Saul understood that Samuel had the support of God and the people, so he made sure everyone knew that he and Samuel were united. The result was that all of Israel came out as one man. Overall, there were 330,000 men, and they told the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead that they would come to their rescue when the sun was hot. They rejoiced, but then sent the following message to Nahash: "Tomorrow we will give ourselves up to you, and you may do to us whatever seems good to you." This seems like a statement of surrender, but they most likely did this to allow Saul to attack Nahash whilst unprepared. The next day, Saul went and separated the soldiers into 3 companies and attacked the Ammonites at dawn. Those who survived of the Ammonites were scattered so that no 2 of them were left together. If we look back to chapter 10, there were some that did not want Saul to be their king. Although Saul had not said anything, the people remembered these worthless fellows, and they wanted to kill them. However, Saul wisely said, "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has worked salvation in Israel." Samuel also seized this moment of unity to renew the kingdom. At the end, there is a celebratory scene in which all were sacrificing peace offerings and rejoicing.
At the beginning of this story, the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead wanted to make a treaty with Nahash, the enemy. Many times we are tempted to think that we can give in to temptation without having to face the consequences. James teaches us that our evil desires lead us to sin, and sin can lead us to death. This is what happened to Judas Iscariot when he betrayed Jesus. He sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, and after he realized his grave error, his sin led him to hang himself. On the other hand, we should learn from Jesus. He was able to resist temptation from the devil himself. and this was the result. The devil left him, and angels came and attended him. When Saul heard that Jabesh Gilead was under siege, he was enraged and took action. Many times we feel a call to serve God, but then we're filled with fear and do nothing. We must remember that James teaches us that faith without works is dead. Perhaps that is why Paul told Timothy that instead of a spirit of fear, God gave us a spirit of power and love and self-control. This is the same spirit that led Peter to preach a sermon in which 3,000 people were saved, and it also led the disciples to share their possessions so that everyone could have food and shelter. In addition, the Spirit of God led the church of Philippi to help Paul in his missionary journeys. Although his recruiting method seemed to be taken out of a mafia film, Saul was able to unite Israel and lead them to rescue Jabesh Gilead. When we work together, we can achieve great things. After Jesus returned to heaven, the apostles devoted themselves to prayer. 10 days later, they were all together in one place and they were filled with the Holy Spirit. This was the beginning of a great revival in which many souls were saved and everyone shared their possessions. It was reminiscent of when Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem from captivity in Babylon to restore it. When he arrived, he found all the walls in ruins and he motivated the inhabitants to rise up and build. The third chapter describes how all the families joined together to build a specific section of the walls and gates, and thus were able to restore Jerusalem as a fortified city in less than 2 months. After defeating Nahash, Samuel called Israel to renew the kingdom. I find this interesting because it seems like not even a year had passed since Saul was named king, yet his kingdom was already being renewed. As a comparison, many couples renew their vows after 20, 30, or 50 years of marriage. However, I think this is a good habit that we can adopt when it comes to our relationship with God. Paul teaches us to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, a continuous devotion to God. Moreover, he states that we must renew our minds to know the will of God. Paul teaches us that in order to achieve this, we must develop our God-given gifts, love others with our deeds as well as our words, and serve God passionately through our service to the church and our communion with Him. If we are not continually remembering to do these things, we will quickly forget about them and will not be faithful followers of Jesus. I pray so that we can always renew our vows to God and serve Him always. Thank you, and God bless you.